Welcome to today's webinar on Purview Information Protection Sensitivity Labels. My name is Terry Johnson. I'm with Synergy Technical and I'm a lead engineer. I focus on security and compliance in Microsoft 365. So what are Purview Information Protection Sensitivity Labels? Purview Information Protection Sensitivity Labels are a feature of Microsoft 365 that allow you to discover, classify, and protect sensitive data at the content level. This could be a document, an email, a meeting, a team site, a SharePoint site, a Power BI dashboard, or other structured data. Ultimately, we are talking about protecting your data from unauthorized access based on how sensitive it is. So protection could be manual, where your users apply classification to their content when it is created, or labels can be automatically applied based on the detection of sensitive information in the content. When we talk about information protection, we are talking really about encryption. Once we protect content with a sensitivity label, the protection stays with the content wherever it is located. It doesn't matter where it is if the protection stays with it. We used to create secure file shares or SharePoint sites and put our sensitive documents in those folders or libraries and apply our permissions to lock everything down. What would happen next is someone would take one of those documents and attach it to an email and send it out in the world where there is no protection on that document. So with sensitivity labels, we don't have to worry about where that content is located anymore. It can be on a thumb drive or in an email or in third-party storage anywhere. The protection is the same no matter where it is. So why is this important? Sensitivity labels are an important part of your overall governance and security strategy. With sensitivity labels, you are identifying how sensitive a piece of data is and applying a well-defined classification policy to that data. Using classification, you are protecting that content based on the sensitivity label and the risk of that data. This helps organizations mitigate the risk by ensuring that only authorized users have access to the content. It also helps mitigate risks associated with accidental sharing or leakage of confidential information. Sensitivity labels are integrated with Microsoft 365, specifically in Defender and Purview, and also in Copilot. For example, you could create a Purview DLP policy that detects and labels sensitive information before it leaves the organization. Microsoft Defender XDR can also detect when a user downgrades sensitivity on content as part of an attack and prioritize security incidents based on the importance of the data. Defender for Cloud Apps can also apply labels to files that are stored in third-party storage, for example. You can also track changes in sensitivity labels with products like Insider Risk Management or Microsoft Sentinel. It's also recommended to have sensitivity labels in place before you deploy Microsoft Copilot. If you have sensitive data that isn't properly labeled, Copilot could potentially include that data in responses or use that content to generate additional content based on that sensitive information. And that is probably not what you want to happen. But Copilot does respect Purview sensitivity labels and will not include content that the user does not have access to as part of the label. So how does it work? Let's take a look at a quick demo of the user experience of using sensitivity labels in Microsoft 365. So for an end user, when they create a document, it can be set to require the user to label the content as it is initially saved, or the user can manually label or change the label later when they are editing the document. So here we have a Word document with a file that perhaps we don't want exposed externally. So we have a couple of options for labeling. We can click on the sensitivity menu on the far right, or we can see up at the top we have where the file name is, we can see that this file has no label. So I'm going to go ahead and click the sensitivity label, and I'm going to choose one of our confidential labels. So this particular content is internal, so I'm going to say all employees, and then I'm going to name the document. And we can see here, this is the label that's being applied. We could have a description of this label here. We can also view the permissions that are associated with this particular label. So when we view the permissions, we can see that this user has the following permissions. Pretty much they have access to do anything they want to the document. However, we could create a label that had more restrictive permissions. So for example, we could create a label where users could view and edit, but they couldn't, for example, print that document. So there's a lot of options when it comes to permissions inside of sensitivity labels. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that file. And we can see the file is saving, and now this label has been applied to the document. And if I were to accidentally, for example, email this document to an external user, the user experience would be that when they attempt to open the document, they would be prompted to sign in to the document, and when they signed in with credentials that were outside of our Microsoft 365 tenant, they would receive a message saying that they did not have access to that content. Same if the content was put on a thumb drive and the thumb drive was lost. Basically, nobody outside of our organization would be able to open that content. Now let's take a look at another scenario. What about automatic labeling? So with sensitivity labels, you can set up auto labeling of content so that when a user pastes sensitive information into a document, the document will automatically recognize that content and suggest to the user to apply a sensitivity label, or automatically apply a sensitivity label based on the sensitive information that is detected. So here we have an Excel file, and I'm just going to paste in some sensitive fake data, and we can see here are some employee social security numbers, and this is definitely information that we don't want exposed to the world. And we can see that as soon as I pasted that content in, we got a policy tip that says your organization recommends that you apply the sensitivity super secret. So this content contains sensitive information and should have the the super secret label. And I have a button where I can go ahead and apply that sensitivity. So I predefined that the super secret label would detect social security numbers and suggest to the user to apply that label. It's also possible to automatically apply the label when that content is detected. And you can also do this with things like credit card numbers or bank routing numbers, any kind of sensitive information type can be used with auto labeling. So it really helps the users to choose the correct sensitivity label for a given piece of content. So, and we can see up at the top, the super secret label has been picked and applied to the document, and we can see based on the icon here that has a little lock that this content is going to be encrypted. So just like our Word document previously, if this document were somehow leaked outside the organization, nobody would be able to open it unless they had credentials that work inside of our tenant. All right, so how do we create a sensitivity label in Microsoft 365? There are a few important decision points once you've decided to create a label based on your classifications that you've defined in your organization. The first piece of information you'll need is the name or classification and a description for the label. The description is displayed to the end users and helps them to pick the correct label. Then you'll need the scope, and this is where is the label applied? Is it going to be applied to files, emails, meetings, groups and sites, or schematized data assets such as SQL? Then you need to pick the access controls, and this is where you decide on the permissions for each group of users that will have access to the label and how long they can access the content. Does it expire after a certain period of time once it's created, or can the user access the content when they are not connected to the internet? Then you have options around content marking, and this applies headers, footers, and watermarks to the documents, emails, or meetings. And then you have choices around auto labeling. So are you going to label content automatically for users or recommend that labels are applied based on sensitive content like social security numbers, passport numbers, credit card numbers, etc.? And then you have site and group settings. And these control the access that internal and external users will have to a site or group, and the external sharing and conditional access settings. And we're going to go through a demo shortly of this in process. So once you've created the sensitivity label, the next step is to publish that sensitivity label. And you have a few decisions to make here as well. So again, we need to choose the labels that we are going to publish. Then admin units. What sections of the business or organization will have access to these labels? The scope, and this is users and groups that this particular label will be available to. And then, are we going to require a justification to lower the classification label? What are our default labels for documents, emails, and meetings? Are you going to require a default label, or are you going to let the user choose the label? And the last step in publishing a sensitivity label is to name the label policy. Once you've done that, the users will then be able to see the labels in their Microsoft 365 apps. So let's take a look at this process in the Microsoft Purview Information Protection portal. Okay, so here we are in the Microsoft Purview Compliance portal. We need to go to the Information Protection section and then Labels. This will load any labels that we've already created, and I've already created a number of labels. We're going to just look at an existing label that I've previously created. Here's our super secret label, and I'm going to go ahead and hit edit. And before we edit the label, I do want to point out that there is a priority column associated with each label. So each label has a priority, and this comes into play when you require justification, for example, to lower the sensitivity of content. So going down in your priority, the user can be required to justify that decision inside of their Microsoft 365 apps. So let's go ahead and edit this super secret label so we can see what's involved in creating it. So the basic details that we need to provide initially are the name of the label, and this is going to be presented to the user in their apps. And then we have a label priority, and this can be changed after the label is created, so it's not critical. You can change this later. And then we have a description that will be displayed to the end users and a description for admins. You can also choose a label color. So we can see I've chosen blue, but we could certainly choose red for our label color, and that will show up in the Microsoft 365 apps. Next, we have to define the scope for the label, and this is the content that this label will be applied to. So in this instance, we've chosen files, emails, and meetings. We could also choose groups and sites or schematized data assets such as SQL, Azure Synapse, Cosmos, etc. So we'll just leave these choices for now. We'll go next. And then we come to the protection settings. And this is really where we are setting the permissions on the label. And this is what each group of user that has access to the label will be able to do with that particular content. And we can also apply content marking and protect teams and meetings and chats as well. So let's go into those settings. So the first thing we have is the access control, and this is the permissions. So we could assign permissions now, or we can give the option to the users to assign the permissions when they apply the label. For now, most organizations choose assign permissions now. And that allows you to have consistency across your labels as opposed to allowing the users to pick the permissions that they want to use. And then we have options around, does this content expire and does user access to it expire? So typically organizations say never, but if it is very sensitive content, it's not uncommon to have the access expire after a certain number of days. So maybe it's a time-sensitive project or time-sensitive data, so you could set that the user loses access to the content after a certain number of days. And then, do we want to allow offline access to this particular content? And you might say, no, I don't want to allow any access to this content when the user is not connected to the internet. But when you think about it, if the user is going to be on an airplane or on vacation or somewhere where they're not going to have good internet access, you might want to allow them a grace period where they can access the content for a small number of days to allow for those scenarios. So in this instance, I've selected 7 days. So this user will have access to the content for 7 days. And if we scroll down, we can choose the permissions. So in this case, all users in the organization have co-author access. If I wanted to, I'm going to go ahead and assign additional permissions. So maybe I wanted to assign permissions to this label to a specific user or group or specific email addresses or domains. This could be for external partner organizations that you work with. Or if we had a label that we wanted to allow external users to access but we didn't have any specific domains that we wanted to restrict that to. We could add any authenticated user, and that would require the users to authenticate with a Microsoft account or to use a one-time passcode to access the content when they open that content. So I'm just going to add a specific group, and this will load the groups in our organization. So I'm going to say executives, and I'll pick that and hit add. And now we have the executives are assigned permissions, and we can choose what permissions executives will have access to. So if we hit the choose permissions, we have a number of predefined options such as co-author, reviewer, viewer, etc. And the permissions will adjust based on that, or we can choose custom permissions. So if I were to change this to reviewer instead of co-author, you can see that the print, copy, and extract options go away. Also, the user is not going to have edit rights or be able to export or save the content. So I'm going to save that, and then we'll hit next. And then we have options around content marking. In this case, I've chosen to add a watermark, and the watermark matches the label name, but you could certainly put additional text in there. We can choose a font size, a font color, and in this case, for a watermark, we can choose how that watermark is displayed on the content. We can also do headers and footers as well. Then if we want to do auto-labeling, as we saw in the previous demo, in this case, when Social Security numbers are detected in the content, it will auto-label that content or suggest that the users apply the label. And we can see when we get a match, we're going to recommend that the users apply the label. We could also automatically apply that label if we wanted to. And we can customize the message that is displayed to give the users a little bit more guidance around why that label is being recommended. And then we have settings around groups and sites, which I didn't choose for this label, but we can choose the privacy, external and external access, the external sharing and conditional access settings, and the discoverability of that particular content or team. Sorry. We can also apply this label to channel meetings if we like. The last option is around schematized data access, such as SQL, and I don't have that selected for this particular label, but you could certainly choose that as an option. And then we just save the label. And then once we hit save, we'll get an option to publish that label if it isn't already published. In this case, it is already published, so we just get the option to close this wizard to create the label. Now let's take a look at what's involved in publishing this label to our users. So to publish a label to users, we go to Label Policies. We could also choose the label and choose Publish Label from the toolbar. Since I've already published this label, I'm just going to go to Label Policies, and we'll review the settings that I've already created. So our first option is, excuse me, I accidentally hit the wrong option. So when we select the label, this will show a preview of the label policy settings. I'm going to go ahead and hit Edit Policy to view the settings that we've already applied. So the first option is to choose the sensitivity label that we're going to publish. And it's not uncommon to have multiple label policies. You might have one label policy that applies a default group of labels that all users have access to, and then have different policies that apply or publish those labels to different groups of users. So in this case, we've chosen the super secret label. And then we can assign admin units, and that would restrict the policy to a specific set of users or groups. In this case, we're not using admin units in this demo tenant. And then we can choose which users are we going to publish this particular label to. In the previous example, where we created the label, we published it to executives, so we could certainly come in here, edit that, and set that only executives would have access to this label. So in this case, all users in the organization would not have access to our super secret label. Now only executives are going to see the super secret label. Then we hit next, and then we get the options around policy settings. So we can require users to provide a justification to remove a label or lower its classification. We can also require users to apply a label to their emails and documents. We can also require users to apply labels to Fabric and Power BI content, and we can also provide users with a link to a custom help page that maybe provides additional guidance around applying these labels. So, are we going to require a default label to be applied to content like Word, Excel, and PowerPoint? In this case, I've chosen no, so I'm going to let the user pick that. We could certainly require that the super secret label is applied to documents. In this case, I'm going to leave that to none. We also have options around emails. Are we going to apply a default label to emails? And are we going to require that users label their emails? Do we want to inherit the label from the attachment? So if a user attaches a document that is labeled super secret, do we want to apply that same label to the email? There are cases where that's appropriate, and there are cases where that is not appropriate. You may want to have a mismatch of the content in the attachment versus what's in the email. And then we have options around meetings and calendar events. Do we want to apply a default label to those types of content? So we could choose the super secret label, and then that would be applied to all meetings and calendar events for the users that have access to this label. And we can also require that users apply a label to their meetings and calendar events. The same with Fabric and Power BI content. And then once we've gone through all of those settings, we name the label policy, provide a description, review the settings that we've chosen, and then submit to publish that label. Once you publish a label, it should show up in the user's Microsoft 365 apps in approximately 24 hours. You can do things to speed that along, but generally I would assume that the labels are going to appear in the Microsoft 365 apps within 24 hours. And that is how you create and publish a label. So what licensing do you need to use Purview sensitivity labels? Generally, for manual sensitivity labels, you need a Microsoft 365 E3 or higher license. You can also use sensitivity labeling with Business Premium licenses. The slide shows all of the licenses that are required for manual sensitivity labeling. If you want to do automatic sensitivity labeling or auto labeling based on the sensitive information that is detected inside the content, then you need a Microsoft 365 E5, A5, or G5 license. You can also use the Microsoft E5, F5, or G5 compliance add-on, or the Microsoft F5 security and compliance add-on. And that concludes the content. I see we have a few questions that have come in during the webinar. So one of the questions we have is, how do I get started? This is a very common question. Synergy Technical does have an engagement around creating sensitivity labels, so we can certainly assist you with that process. Generally, you want to start with creating your classification system that you're going to use before you start creating labels. So decide what labels you have, or what sensitive information you have in your organization that you want to label, and that will guide you through the label creation process. Let's see, another question that we have is, how many labels are recommended? There's no firm answer here. Generally, you want to start small. Start with a small group of users and a small group of labels. Keep it simple as possible for your end users. You don't want to give them 20 choices of labels. 3 to 5 labels is a really good starting point for labeling with purview sensitivity labels. Another question we have is, can I pilot without rolling out labels to everyone? Yes, you absolutely can, and actually I would recommend this. Start with departments in your organization that have a lot of sensitive information. So HR is a great example, finance or accounting. Those departments tend to have a lot of data that is sensitive, and you wouldn't want that data to leak. So I recommend starting with those departments. You can create specific labels around the content that those departments have, and once you're comfortable and those departments have been using the label for a few weeks to a month, then you can start planning for a larger rollout to the organization. What about auto-labeling? Auto-labeling is great. It allows your users to kind of not have to make the decision on the sensitive information that's detected. So auto-labeling is a great way to help your users pick the type of label that you want them to apply to a specific sensitive information. Another label, let's see. What about historical label? Historical data or legacy data? This is a question we get asked a lot. You start labeling content at a certain point, but what about all those terabytes of data that you have sitting in SharePoint or Teams or other repositories? So there's a number of options around this. You can do auto-labeling with SharePoint sites based on sensitive information that's detected and automatically label content accordingly. You can also use PowerShell to label content that's in repositories. And there's also a information protection scanner that can be used, that can be deployed and used to label bulk data, basically. Okay, next question. Can I label Teams content? Yes, absolutely, you can label Teams content. You can label not only teams themselves, which will allow you to set a sensitivity label on a team that controls access to the particular team. You can also use sensitivity labels on Teams meetings, and that will control who can bypass the lobby, who can present and record. It will also set encryption options for the meeting video and audio. It will automatically watermark screen sharing and those camera streams. And you can also use sensitivity labels to prevent or allow copying chat contents from your meetings. Let's see, another question. if I label my data, can it be used with AI tools such as Microsoft Copilot? This question is getting a lot of interest right now. Copilot does respect purview information protection sensitivity labels. So if you have sensitive information that is labeled and a user does not have access to that content, Copilot will respect that and will not return that data to the user when prompted. Copilot also will not use that content that the user doesn't have access to when generating new content. So applying sensitivity labels is really recommended before you start using Copilot, so you can at least protect your really sensitive data so that it's not exposed to users. All right, I think that's all the questions we have in the chat right now. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar on sensitivity labels. I hope you found the content valuable. Have a good day.